Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a young woman on December 23, 1862. He wrote to the daughter of a friend of his, Lieutenant Colonel William McCulloch. McCulloch was killed in action on December 5th. He had been a close friend of Lincoln's from his days in Illinois, and at the beginning of the Civil War he joined the Union Army with Lincoln's permission, despite having lost a leg and the use of one eye. Lincoln was informed by mutual friends that McCulloch's daughter, Fanny, was suffering excessively from the loss. Lincoln felt compelled to write a letter of condolence to Fanny. We do not know if he felt any guilt for the death of his friend, and perhaps that is why he wrote, but in any case it was heartfelt and sincere. The letter was written amid much political and military turmoil and his own personal sufferings. It is an example of singular compassion and sympathy. One cannot but see the deep suffering Lincoln had endured in his life, his capacity to empathize and alleviate the anguish of others, and his ability to look beyond himself despite his own suffering to lead the country. Many might say that this brief letter of condolence is just an example of a friend reaching out to help another through a difficult time, and perhaps take note of how beautifully it was written. But it reveals much more than friendship and exquisite prose. It provides a window into Lincoln's character, a character that practiced virtue to the point of heroism. Popular culture today often looks at heroism as completing feats of bravery, such as a soldier throwing himself on a grenade to protect his fellow soldiers, running into a burning building to save a child, or jumping into a rushing river to rescue someone from drowning. While all these are examples of undoubted courage and heroism, there are other ways of being heroic that are often overlooked because they seem so mundane. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. Virtue becomes courageous when it is put to the test. Heroism is not just for those moments of extreme distress and difficulty, but it is also for times that occur on an everyday basis, in which we are challenged to be virtuous in ordinary circumstances that are difficult. It is virtue without conditions. These are the times that are hidden away and unseen, but they make up the largest portion of our lives." Lincoln wrote this letter at the end of a very difficult year for the Union's cause and for him personally. His son Willie had died from sickness just 10 months before. He had had to battle General George McClellan on war strategy and McClellan's hesitation to engage the enemy, which resulted in Lincoln firing him. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued and was about to go into effect. The Union Army had just experienced a crushing defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and Lincoln weathered the storm of a crisis in his cabinet that month that almost resulted in Secretary of State Seward and Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase resigning. It is hard to imagine the President of the United States finding time for something so small and seemingly unimportant at such a difficult and challenging time. Surely this would be a time at which no one could fault Lincoln for not finding time to write a letter of condolence. Instead, he leaves his monumental concerns for a few moments, and his generosity, magnanimity, and leadership shine forth in a simple letter to a friend to help ease her suffering. At the beginning of the letter, Lincoln expressed his own grief and acknowledged that Fanny was suffering beyond what is common in such cases. In a letter from Laura Swett, a McCulloch family friend, to Justice David Davis, a friend to Lincoln, Swett described the effect that McCulloch's death was having on his daughter. "She has neither ate or slept since the tidings of her father's death, but shuts herself in her room in solitude, where she passes her time in pacing the floor in violent grief or sitting in lethargic silence." Lincoln then subtly referred to his own personal sufferings when he wrote, "In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to us all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares." Lincoln lost his mother at the tender age of 9. He understood Fanny's grief and knew how hard it was to endure. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, reported that after the death of their mother, Lincoln and his sister Sarah lived a very poor existence without her. In the next sentence, Lincoln hinted at his present sorrow when he wrote, "The older have learned to ever expect it." Lincoln's son Willie died of typhoid fever on February 20th, 1862. This was the second time Lincoln had lost a child. 12 years earlier, his son Eddie died of tuberculosis. While Lincoln did not speak of his personal loss directly, he alluded to it and thereby generously opened himself up to comfort Fanny. At a time of severe difficulty, he unstintingly gave of himself. In the next paragraph, Lincoln shared the wisdom he gained through his trials. He explained to Fanny that perfect relief is not possible except with time. He assured her that she would feel better even though at the present time she could not imagine it so. Joshua Schenck, in his book Lincoln's Melancholy, commented on the letter. The issues at stake in the Civil War included the future of slavery, the nature of democracy, and the fate of the United States. Lincoln's letter to Fanny McCullough dealt explicitly with none of these things. Lincoln proved himself to be a man of uncommon virtue by taking the time out of his busy, stressful schedule to help one individual through her suffering, while he had so many other worries, duties, and pressures. Schenck goes on to explain that Lincoln understood that he was one of those people who was unusually affected by the hardships of life, and at times he thought the suffering would never end. He argues that Lincoln learned to tolerate the sufferings and use it for good. Lincoln exercised leadership, compassion, kindness, and fortitude to a heroic degree by writing this letter. He did not forget as commander-in-chief that he was a father figure to many, and so sought to comfort the daughter of a dear friend even while under extreme stress. This father-like figure and his deep compassion was also described by a young man, John M. Bullock, who went to the White House seeking a parole for his dying brother, who was a Confederate. He described his ease at speaking with Lincoln as if talking to his own father. While there are only a few letters of condolence from Lincoln that we know of, one can imagine he could very well have written more, but they have not survived. In May of 1861, he wrote to the parents of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who had been killed the day before in Virginia. Lincoln knew Ellsworth when he worked in Lincoln's office in Springfield. While it may not be considered such eloquent writing as the McCullough letter, it is still a great example of Lincoln's compassion and sympathy for those suffering from the war. He signed the letter "in a common affliction," indicating he understood the parents' agony and was grieving with them. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote in Team of Rivals that she did not believe Lincoln suffered from chronic depression as Schenck claims. However, she does admit that he had a melancholic temperament, but it was the overcoming of his temperament that speaks to his greatness. She wrote, Lincoln possessed an uncanny understanding of his shifting moods. Indeed, when he is compared with his colleagues, it is clear that he possessed the most even-tempered disposition of them all. He was the one who dispelled his colleagues' anxiety and sustained their spirits with his gift for storytelling and his life-affirming sense of humor. When resentment and contention threatened to destroy his administration, he refused to be provoked by petty grievances, to submit to jealousy, or to brood over perceived slights. Through the appalling pressures he faced day after day, he retained an unflagging faith in his country's cause. Whether he suffered from depression or not, Goodwin describes a man of incredible virtue who selflessly put his own melancholic temperament aside and gave of himself to lift the mood and encourage others to carry on despite the difficulties of life. This is an example of extraordinary leadership. Some may say this does not rise to the level of courage or heroism, but I would argue that small acts such as these done in an ordinary way are precisely what help us see the deep, heroic virtue exemplified by Lincoln.